The smell of bread, real bread, warm from the oven, is something most people take for granted now. I didn't, not for a very long time, and I'm not sure I ever fully do, even today. I was born in the winter of 1940, in a terraced house in Coventry, the second of 4 children. My mother kept a vegetable patch in what had been the flower garden, because flowers were a luxury and potatoes were not. My father worked at the Standard Motor Works until he was called up, and after he left, my mother worked there instead, on the night shift, making parts for aircraft engines. She never made a great deal of noise about any of this. It was simply what you did. By the time I was old enough to understand what a ration book actually was, I had already been living inside the logic of it for years. Everything we ate, everything we wore, every small pleasure had a weight to it. Not a moral weight, exactly, but a practical one. You could want something all you liked. Wanting didn't enter into it. Our ration books were kept in a tin on the mantelpiece, next to a photograph of my father in uniform. My mother treated them the way some women treat their housekeeping ledgers, with absolute precision, a kind of quiet authority. She knew to the ounce what we had coming and what we had spent. 2 ounces of butter per person per week, an ounce of cheese, a single egg, if you were lucky, and some weeks the egg didn't arrive at all. I remember the specific weight of an orange at Christmas, the one orange, tissue-wrapped, that appeared at the bottom of a stocking, as if it were a piece of gold. I turned it in my hands before I peeled it. I smelled it first. I made it last. School was where you noticed the hunger most clearly, not in yourself, but in other children. There was a girl in my class, Margaret, whose family had it harder than most. Her father hadn't come home, and her mother was unwell. Margaret was thin in a way that you could see in her wrists, in the particular stillness of her face when the dinner lady brought the school meal around. The meals themselves were nothing much, a grey-looking stew sometimes, or a pudding made with dried egg that had a faintly sulphurous smell. But Margaret ate every mouthful as though she were memorizing it. I think about Margaret sometimes, still. She taught me something important without ever meaning to, that scarcity isn't equally distributed. It never is. The street we lived on had a particular rhythm. Mondays were for washing, lines of sheets and shirts strung between the houses. Fridays were for the queue at the butcher's, which my mother joined early before I left for school, and which she was still sometimes in when I came home for lunch. Queuing was its own kind of work. You didn't complain about it. You simply factored it into the day. There were small abundances, too. I want to be fair about that. The allotment 2 streets over, where Mr. Hadley grew runner beans and let the neighbourhood children pick the windfalls. The way my mother could make a pound of mince stretch across 3 meals without any of them feeling like deprivation, exactly, though you couldn't have said why. The national dried milk, household milk they called it, which was a powder you mixed with water and which tasted of nothing in particular, but which you drank without comment because it was there and it was yours. In the summer of 1947, there was a bread shortage, the first in living memory, or so the grown-ups said, and it surprised me that things could get worse after the war had ended rather than better. I was 7 by then, old enough to feel the injustice of it, but not quite old enough to understand the economics. We had won, hadn't we? I had been told we had won. And yet the bread was still rationed, the sugar was still rationed, and my mother's face still carried that particular expression she had when she was doing arithmetic in her head. What I remember most from that summer is not the shortage itself, but my mother's hands. She had the hands of someone who had been working since before I could remember, reddened at the knuckles, capable, never entirely still. That summer, she learned to make a kind of flat loaf using whatever flour she could source, and she would bake it on a Friday evening after her shift. The smell of it filled the whole house. We ate it with margarine, never butter, not then, and it tasted, I am not exaggerating, better than anything I have eaten since. I think it tasted of her effort. I think I understood that even at 7, in the wordless way that children understand things before they have the language for them. The ration books finally ended in 1954. I was 14. I remember the date, the 4th of July, because someone at school said it was American independence, and we laughed, though none of us were quite sure of the joke. The meat ration was the last to go. My mother bought a joint of lamb that week, an actual joint, more than we would have been allowed in a month under rationing, and she stood in the kitchen looking at it for a long moment before she put it in the oven. She didn't say anything. She just stood there. I have thought about that moment many times over the years, trying to understand what was in her face. It wasn't joy, exactly. Or not only joy. It was something more complicated than that. The expression of a person who had held something tightly for so long that releasing the grip was its own kind of loss. She had been vigilant for 14 years. She had made it work every single week through the arithmetic of small portions and careful planning, and nothing wasted, ever. And now, the thing she had been braced against had simply stopped. I think that must be a disorienting feeling. I think it must take time to unknot. We ate the lamb on a Sunday, the 4 of us and my father, who had come home from the war with a slight limp and a habit of long silences that we had all learned to read. He had seconds. He didn't say anything about the rationing ending, or about the years we had spent inside it. He passed his plate, and he had seconds, and my mother served him, and that was that. I am in my 80s now, which means I have had the luxury of watching Britain change at a pace that still occasionally takes my breath away. Supermarkets, where the bread aisle alone contains more variety than our whole street saw in a month. Food from countries I had never heard of at 14. Choices, endless, almost bewildering choices, where there was once only necessity. I do not want to be sentimental about scarcity. Scarcity is not romantic. It was hard, and it was harder for some than for others, and there was nothing improving about being hungry or cold or wearing your brother's shoes because your own had worn through. I am not telling you it built character, because I think that is too easy a thing to say about someone else's difficulty. But I do think there is something worth holding on to from those years. Something about attention, about noticing, about the orange turned slowly in the hands before the peel comes away, the bread smelled before it's eaten, the joint of lamb looked at for a long, silent moment in a small kitchen in Coventry. I still do it, even now. I catch myself doing it. A small pause before the first bite. A moment of something that isn't quite gratitude and isn't quite grief. Some feeling that doesn't have a clean name for the distance between then and now. I'd be curious whether any of you carry something like that, whether there's a particular food or a particular moment that connects you to someone who lived through those years. A parent, a grandparent, someone whose silence you're still learning to read. If there is, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. This narration is a fictionalised composite, inspired by well-documented experiences of British civilians during wartime and post-war rationing. It does not represent the account of any single real individual.